This is Ancestor Land, a short story from the book Marginal, read and written by Grant J. Riley. The only thing moving in the murk are the swirls of frozen fog, leaning out from behind the trees, occasionally lurking around a trunk, and at times stretching ethereally across the path. It's probably 2 degrees below tonight. It will possibly sink another 2 or more before daybreak. It has been frozen for months amidst one of the harshest winters for years, only intermittently pausing for a bout of drizzle, otherwise simply raw. They don't use torches. Sean can see as far ahead and all around, never having to adjust his eyes. It is unlikely at this time of night that anyone is in wait, but you never know. And besides, as the time is now getting close, he wants to be able to pitch his night vision against those who might not be able to see in the dark so well. They have been in these woods for nearly 6 months, so each step is well rehearsed. And as for torches, they just give you away. A sleeping pheasant is disturbed. Its alarm echoes throughout the frozen forest. It doesn't bother them, as this is their land, for now. They are the last people to dwell in these woods. Some of these trees in their infancy may have hosted armies of the Civil War, giving shelter here and there. Undoubtedly, much of this land has watched the comings and goings since the last ice retreated. Matured, yes, but pretty much unchanged. The morphic resonance of this woodland is obvious, especially in the dark. One need not close their eyes and imagine, it is simply just there. This is Ancestor Land. They have been spread out, but eventually gather at the base camp, beneath the almighty pine. The collective voices are once again rowdy, returning to a similar level of volume as when they had left the town. A few complaints are yelled out from 100 feet above, and jovial obscenities are exchanged. The remainders of a fire smoulders as Sean stokes it, waiting for his turn to get into the tree. As the first flames begin to lick, he looks out over that agonizing vista into the night's tenebrosity. The young man squats on his haunches and rubs his hands warm as he ponders the landscape in front of him. Where once stood ancient woodland, now lays mud. Skirmishes have been intensifying over the last few winter months, the Romans ever encroaching. Their empire of dirt expands. Mighty and ancient oak trees are being destroyed without a thought, their corpses dragged onto pyres, smouldering heaps that last for months. Their centuries of history lost forever. This ancestor land defiled. You will find it hard to describe your connection to the land, especially to the rationalists. They don't seem to be able to understand the time frame for such a habitat to exist, those millennia past. They can't see that this is all our heritage and impossible to replace. The practical and the conservative repeat, we must have progress at all costs. Growth, they say, is essential and just. Cancerous, Sean thinks to himself. They would be horrified if I chopped up an antique table for kindling right now, mortified if I'd used an ancient manuscript to light my fire. But this landscape, to the pragmatic, is disposable, desecrated forever, without grace. Fire now rages. Dry and seasoned blackthorn lick with decent flames. These particular sticks have been saved for those coldest of nights. The sadness and the rage enters his soul once again, as it does when you get a few moments alone. The mud of their progress, featureless and grim. They know they are coming for them tomorrow, and Sean is away, deep in his thoughts as he contemplates potentially his last night here. He knows they are coming, but only in his bones. There is no real evidence, perhaps by a process of elimination, they are coming to get them next. The weather has held the forces back a few times with heavy blizzards of snow. So too have allies on the mainland, who sabotaged some of their more recent attempts. But now they are coming. They are ready. So sure. Everyone knew it at the clock tower earlier this night. Even Casey, the landlady, she recognised that this time was now. She even gave them a dusty old bottle of mead which she'd been saving for a particular event. She knew it was time. They all knew it was time. They had been some of her best customers over the months, always bringing wise cracks and wild stories, along with unusual and plentiful custom. And now it was over. They were bought drinks all night as everyone knew it was going to be their last session in here. It is at least a few hours walk back to the camp. Sean loved these late winter nights. Overland and through the woods, warmly glow from alcohol and heavy protective clothing, snug and cocooned. Yet he is in need of relieving himself, and his frozen fingertips now grapple with the underwear. Top layers of dense weatherproofs cover a thick pair of trousers over long johns, with a harness in between the upper two. The harness never comes off at this stage. To successfully complete a basic need in this attire takes some patience and expertise. Get it wrong in these conditions could mean a seriously uncomfortable night. A shout comes from above. Sean's long stare at the fire is broken. It's his turn to ascend. First taking a long, slow and very cold deep breath, he then purposefully rises to stand. Thin prusik ropes are pulled out from under the first layer of trousers. The two strands are not much fatter than a shoelace. Both are tied to the hanging rope with a very specific prusik knot, one above the other. Top rope is attached to a carabiner on the harness, whilst the other dangles freely for the foot. Each knot tightens around the rope when weighted and is easily undone when the weight is released, theoretically. A few checks and alterations are made. Sean twists and unclips a carabiner and moves the figure of 8 back into the position out of the way. It had not been adjusted since his abseil earlier in the day. He briefly inspects the aluminium tool as he moves it and observes deep and worn helical grooves from overuse and simply tucks to himself. Sean stands alone, the last on the ground, just him and the dark of the forest, and stares straight up the 90 feet above to a small, shining light through a hatch. It's always a long way up, and it never gets any easier. The sheer physical exhaustion of hauling your body up and over again, and the fear, the absolute fear. Dangling high above the ground on 2 thin bits of rope has its risks, and your body's chemistry never lets you forget it. Not for one moment. Sean sits back in his harness and lowers his total weight to just a few feet above the ground. He bounces for a safety check, makes sure everything is still tied on correctly, and hup! And another hup! His freezing fingers loosen the top prusik knot as he slides it a few more inches up the rope. He then leans back in the harness once again. Sean tilts and slides his foot prusik a similar distance as the top knot before, and hup! Now standing up, knees straight, 1 foot held in the lower prusik loop. The ale swirls around Sean's belly. His abdominals work extra hard. He does not always enjoy this climb, but is the only way home at this stage, and another hup! Shaking and sweating from the sheer effort, yet he is hardly 10 feet off the ground. Eventually, about 50 feet up, there is just the silence of the forest, what's left of it. The smell of pyres in the air and the pain of the icy cold air fill his fully inflated lungs. In those earlier halcyon months at the end of last summer, This was simply paradise. A solo Corsican pine had been found penetrating the canopy of ancient oaks in Redding's Copse. A single raised finger to the world. A completely straight and solid length of timber that towered over 130 feet or more into the sky above this ancient coppice. These woods have been here for centuries, if not forever, always defying the biggest of storms. The pine had even survived 87, but its days are numbered. It's possibly down to its last hours. Now it towers almost alone. A few remaining oaks and their occupants remain. The last faithful guards stand close by in this otherwise muddied desert. The first bough of the pine is about 90 feet. John the bowman had been drafted in for his services. He expertly attached a fishing line to one of his arrows, fired it up and over this branch neatly enough for the arrow to drop to the other side and slowly fall back to the ground. A sizable length of rope was attached to the fishing line and hauled up and over, slip knotted and then tied. Then came the first ascent up high into this pine. Once into these primary boughs, the spiral staircase of horizontal branches make good for an excellent clamber. Climb up through another 30 feet of the tree and the crow's nest is eventually reached. At about halfway up this staircase, you osmotically breach the semi-permeable membrane of the forest canopy and meet the sky. From the darkness of Ancestor land below, up above is all clear and blue. A few more branches further up the staircase, a pristine orange and yellow carpet spreads out below. The tops of the oak forest are incredibly smooth and even, reaching out as far as can be seen in every direction. The pine just so happened to be very much in the middle of this copse. During those early days, the autumn colours offered a spectacular spectacle that very few ever get to appreciate. The unity of the forest community is so strikingly different from this unusual perspective. Its magnificent canopy viewed from high up above. By the time the crow's nest is grasped, views all across the Berkshire landscape can be seen. A castle sits on one hill, a tower occupies another. The pine feels equal and mighty. For now, Sean is more bothered by a wind that joins him. About halfway up the rope, more than 50 feet from the ground below, there is little left to protect him from the frosty blast gathering itself from the north. It blows harder as ice forms on his face. Sinking back into the harness, he adjusts a scarf across his nose and chin, all tucked under a black woolen hat. Sean squeezes his eyes to avoid the worst. His fingers are now completely numb as the wind quickly lowers the temperature even further. The prusik knots are becoming increasingly impossible to undo. Sean can't feel his hands at all. Don't look down. Never look down. But involuntarily peaks. It's more than just the fear. The chemistry brings up the now curdled alcohol from his gut. He slowly debates the bile in his mouth before he reluctantly swallows, for spit may freeze, something to be avoided at all costs. The icy blast is starting to make his whole body spin, slowly at first. He has no choice but to grab the main rope tightly and hug with all his force, knees clenched, chin to fists, feet and rope entwined, as the wind begins to give Sean a most unwelcome twirl. He tucks his face further into his chest, keeping his eyes tightly shut now. It is an extraordinarily silent and private moment. Helpless, dangling, spinning, in the total darkness, alone. Sean does not know how long it lasts. potentially another near-death experience. The mental state, shamanic. However, he does manage to survive once again. As Jack Frost eventually abates after doing his worst, the brawny and lean Sean just has to thrash himself like whips to a pack of huskies. He has simply got to get to the top. There is no choice. Now, focusing on the stove, hopefully that tin of tuna he stashed earlier hasn't been found. Sean concentrates on images of the faces, the fire, and hopefully another drink. The will powers him further up the rope. Eventually, faint voices can be heard and the light grows ever nearer. Finally, two pairs of strong hands rapidly lift Sean through the hatch as if he is a sack of potatoes. And before he realises it, he is on his feet once more. Sean's head spins. The donut is an impressive structure and has become rather spectacular over these last few months. A two-storey treehouse that wraps itself around the huge girth of the pine. It sleeps about 14 like sardines and has wood burning and gas stoves, wall-to-wall carpet, windows, a roof, and is almost fully waterproof. An absolute luxury around these parts. Tonight it is crammed. Most familiar, some not. Some on form, some subdued. One man rages as another relaxes. There is even a Guardian journalist crammed in there, decorated by a necklace of cameras. There is lager, whiskey and ginger wine. A radio crackles further drunken nonsense, yet it gives the acknowledgement they are not entirely alone up here in the canopy, deep in this landscape. Sean is the last one in and closes the hatch behind him. Scouse is ranting, his voice is hoarse. He takes more than his fair share of the room as he boils a pan of water on the stove, his dreadlocks regularly smashing his neighbours in the face. His sheer size overwhelms some of these confined quarters. Shiner offers Sean a beer and catches adrenaline in his glint. This, after all, is what they have survived on and thrived on for months. But even at this late stage, tonight is the big one. They don't know for sure, but collectively they share it. There is something undoubtedly in the air. The night rolls on as they tuck into their supplies. Soon they'll be under siege and they have stocked up, but as usual, they make a fairly hefty dent in what has been retained. Scouse has finished boiling his bags and now offers Sean a handful, cod and parsley sauce. Sean knows the routine, gives them a shake and a wipe to dry, before putting one bag in each trouser pocket and another two in his top pockets. They're going up to the crow's nest. There is no comfort up there. It is a sudden and unwelcome return to the elements as Sean and Scouse leave the warmth and the company of the donut behind. They each squeeze slowly through the top hatch. Snow is floating around the tree. It is a little more pleasant than the icy wind from before. Climb is relatively easy. However, to fall from here is undoubtedly death. In the dark, drunk and exhausted, yet exhilarated, they remain clipped onto safety ropes all of the way. The clamber involves navigating around a now fully barricaded tree. Hefty cargo nets droop from boughs full of essentials, firewood, building wood, buckets, nails and more rope. High tensile steel cables are pulled taut connecting to the few remaining oaks. This section of the tree is chock full, part decor and part deterrent. By sunrise, these branches will be full of people. The very last drops of energy allow Sean to hoist himself up onto the final platform at around 120 feet. His arms press up as his belly slithers across the boards. The pain in his exhausted legs is immense, now forcing them up and into the crow's nest. This was the first structure to be built on the pine and is simply two wooden pallets positioned and roped together. It has hazel bender poles and a tarpaulin cover. The frontage is open to the elements. The vista, priceless. A red dragon on a yellow flag gives colour to the shelter but little in the way of protection, a present from a former campaign. There is also an Aberdeen Angus hide, which a lucky one gets to shelter under, another cherished gift from the people, but there will be no sleeping tonight. An old ammo box is tucked under one edge of the tarp. It contains meagre supplies, occasional treats and a small camping gas bottle. The regulator will be frozen, so Sean administers the regular procedure, which is to lean over the edge and urinate on the gas bottle, trying not to soak his hands. The warm bodily fluid temporarily heats the gas, enough to light it for just a few moments. Then quickly a small amount of water is heated in a thin aluminium billy can. When the flame goes out, a few moments later, the hot water is then poured onto the gas bottle and the process repeated. This can go on for some time if the temperature is particularly low, but eventually you get a hot cup of tea. On some of those first frozen mornings they had been caught unprepared. On waking with dry mouths, dehydrated by the cold and the drinks from the night before, tongues had stuck to the roofs of mouths as refreshment was desperately sought. Ice was all that was on the menu, if you were lucky enough to be able to get any out of the frozen water bottle. Never again, Sean had decided, after sticking ice to his leathery, dry tongue. From then on, he always slept with a water container as close to his body heat as he could bear. Sean and Scouse sit crouched and cross-legged, staring out into the abyss. From inside Scouse's many layers, the old bottle of mead is pulled out, like a rabbit from a hat. Nice one. A corkscrew on a string tied to a bender pole is pulled out ceremoniously to open the bounty. All more cons up here, you see. But to drop such a tool from this height would have very upsetting consequences for all parties involved. Sean pulls the first of the boil in the bags out of his chest pocket. Its warmth has been invaluable. The ones in his trouser pockets have stopped his bollocks from freezing off. Scouse retrieves one of his own bags and they both simultaneously tear off the corners with their teeth, like cavemen. Tilting their heads back and sucking out the contents of a now lukewarm, processed yellow and creamy slop is simply gourmet up here. They've been at it for some years now, up and down this land. First there was St Catherine's Hill, the beauty all around, outstanding even by their account. Another timeless, sacred and irreplaceable landscape. Glorious old England simply hacked into pieces. The urbanities didn't escape either. London's East End, its cherished and revered communities were having none of it, but also got felled by the same axe. Then they went up north to the valleys of Stanworth. This is where they first took to the trees. The madness, the ferocity, the complete disregard. Salisbury Hill got it, but not without total resistance. The once fair mile, now disquieted forever. By the time they crossed the border into Scotland, the Picts had come down from their hideaways and the people of Pollock stood shocked as their prehistoric landscape was eaten up before their eyes. What sickness brings this upon these lands? They call it progress. We call it greed. This night, full darkness, they are only just a short while away. They wake the forest by roaring into the dark, letting the ancestors know the defiance is exercised, out into the imminent dawn. Eventually, through the daybreak, a picture very slowly emerges, like a black and white photograph developing, pegged out on a line, its fluids draining. They can make out the first signs as things begin to clear. The boundary silhouettes, the vast mud ahead. Then one white wagon appears, then another. Yellow coats begin to spew out of each van. It's impressive, they really have gone to town. Over 1,000 fluorescent beings begin to take their place, a mile-long cordon to protect the scene of their final crime. Their piece de resistance, all gleaming white. A dinosaur, a trebuchet, a gigantic machine of malintent. By the time it reaches the mud, the daylight gives way and the full spectacle unfolds, 120 feet below. The Romans marched their beast onto the sludge they had fought so hard to secure. Flanked by ranks of 20 or more, they are now joined by columns of the black and blue. An indecisive sleety drizzle ensues as the wheels turn so very slowly. It is an age before it takes its ready position, a grand ceremony for this obscene beast. The forest eaters are coming in for the kill, their imperialism now turned in on itself. All is temporarily silent, just the crunching sound of caterpillars across ancient roots. They should have brought drums and conches to put a finishing touch to this absurd scene. Sean and Scouse blare their air horns across the countryside, heard for miles around. It's us! It's our turn! Everyone is to know! Up and around the tree, people take their positions, each with their own strategy, simply and silently wait. Their tools had been too short at first to reach them in this mighty tree. They had previously sent for loftier contraptions. Alas, their early attempts were regularly thwarted by distant allies on the mainland, significantly delaying and frustrating them for some time. Eventually they acquired this one, here, now, and it stretches up and up until it is above the crow's nest. Impressive and equally ghastly. Helmeted Neanderthals at the operations, exchanging abuse on their way to the top. They swipe the huge banner, the Union Jill, from the very summit of the tree. Triumphant they wave it as they shout out into the early morning sky. They eventually return at eye level, rabid dogs in their cage. They growl and they bark and they froth. Their hatred is still astounding to this very day. Sean is sure they would kill him if they could. Exactly why he's not so sure. Can't be for the wages because they're so measly. Is it just these kind of people that they stick to these posts? Deranged and psychotic, just doing my job. It's always been that way. Despite the increasing aggression directed at them, they had all long agreed that non-violent and direct action was the only way. The activists won't fight back, despite being confronted by knives and swords, their insults, promises, tricks and lies. Sean has grown used to all of this, but for them, it's becoming increasingly personal. They hack and they slash at the tips of the pine's boughs. Greenery falling like giant feathers slowly to the ground. Some of the people are far out onto these limbs, roped in above and below, equipped with bender whips and frays to slow the onset of their swords. Molten blue polypropylene clogs the chains on the very hot bars of their now stalling machines. Engines splutter, curses are yelled, and a temporary quiet is restored. Still, a few manage to break through. Inevitably, they carve their way ever closer, honing in on the trunk. That reserved pot of yogurt, which had been waiting here for 6 months, is now accurately thrown down the back of the collar of the first Neanderthal to attack. As he swipes forward, the gap between his neck and his boiler suit become apparent and is now filled with semi-frozen, mouldy dairy slop. His retreat is hysterical. The next to attack receives a small latex glove filled with a dollop of shitty brown paint. A gentle but constant barrage of these paint bombs is enough to set off the aerial assault. And the beast quickly retracts its neck as its operatives swiftly and desperately withdraw. whoops, jeers and cries boom across the expansive opening. Ground support has now arrived in good numbers, and further sounds come up from below. Sean climbs the footladder, strapped to the uppermost tip of the pine, and gains another 15 feet above the scenario. A single fist raised high in the sky. He can feel trees crashing around him, and down below the last of the ancient oaks are being felled. Their weight, like collapsing elephants, cry so slowly as they smash to the ground. Sean feels their death quake all the way up here. Another falling tree hits the side of the pine. The enormous weight of centuries of steady growth jolts so severely it nearly throws all out of the tree. They shake the trees in moments like these, manic, primitive, despairing and angry. Sean and Scouse howl, and the wind joins them and they howl some more. The branches shake, and the wind screams furthermore. Then there is the most almighty crash, and then screams, shouts, roar. They have pushed the last oak tree over, and along with it have severed the neck of their prized beast. Not only have they hit their crane, but they have carelessly felled 3 of their climbers. The men could be badly hurt, and the atmosphere now changes. Serious, silent, potential death is in the air. The extent of their aggression now turned inward, taken out by friendly fire, man down. Sean gets back in the crow's nest and manoeuvres to get a better view. At first he sees their now pathetic and mangled wreck of a machine, contorted and dead under the weight of a 500-year-old oak. You can also see their sheriff in his red hard hat. He callously looks up as he continues to eat a sandwich. The rest of his team are a lot more concerned than their sheriff. A major rescue ensues. The climbers looked shocked, but seemed to have escaped the worst. The mercenary hired helpers are now carted away. 3 are stretchered out. It takes time for the chainsaws to retrieve their broken beast. Pitifully, and eventually it reverses, an ungainly withdrawal. All heads are lowered. The yellow and blue coats all go home for the day. The scale of this spectacle has been astounding. Their retreat subdued. None of them seem to believe in this. Most of them are here on just the minimum pay. It's just another shitty day. The pine is the last one standing in this former forest, the only tree that remains upright in these hectares of once ancestor land. Remaining defiant for a little while longer, nothing at all will stand in their way of their progress. Ancestor Land was read and written by Grant J. Riley. The book Marginal, available at lulu.com. Get out and defend your forests, innit?